Well, welcome, Georgi, to this dialogue today, to this conversation. It's our first video that we're doing for this channel, the cooperation paradigm. So
Hmm.
thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And before I talk a little bit why maybe I invited you to the call, I want to talk about what is the cooperation paradigm for those who are listening to this for the first time. And basically, it's just a platform that we use, our platform we have to explore and to foster, to spread the idea that we have a very competitive paradigm world, and really the solution is not in a new set of policies or in a new I don't know, educational approach or technique or anything like that, but it has to run a little deeper and really change the paradigm that we have in our society to start cooperating, to start collaborating with each other. And
Right.
we are like, when we implement that to the degree that we need, I mean, anything is possible. That we really can turn around any situation that we face in our planet. So basically that's what the cooperation paradigm is. And now I want to say why I invited you to the call, Georgie, because I got to know you a little bit through Danny Roddy. That's
Hmm.
how I heard you for the first time, and I have to say you blew my mind, man, with the stuff that you know. Uh, and uh, and not only I learned a lot from listening to those podcasts and in other places also that I have listened to you, but you really show me that you're a really objective person in a way when you approach your research. And so you are an open-minded but critical person. And that's
Right.
really difficult to find these days because everybody seems to have an ideology that they stick to. And
Sure.
even scientists, and you talk about this sometimes, like how almost there is like a religion, for in the scientific community.
Absolutely.
And it's so hard to really advance as a society if we are just thinking that we have figured this thing out. We're not objective with our research. So I really admire the way you approach things, not only the scientific aspect, but also the other stuff that you share with everyone on Twitter and other channels. So that's why I thought like, man, Georgie is the guy, and I wanted to invite you, and you were kind enough to give us some time today. So thank you so much. And if you want to add anything to that introduction, please go ahead. You're very welcome.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, just as you have noticed and you're starting to write about this topic, one of the first things that got me into this whole idea of metabolic health science and politics and life in general is the fact that I noticed that the world is shifting towards not just competition but a fight for survival, right?
Hmm.
And then this, in a sense, is kind of like a regression because the fight for survival is the law of the jungle, right? There's nothing wrong with competition as long as competition is not for survival. But when it becomes a fight for survival, then it turns into this social Darwinism approach, which is what fascism and some of the really horrible doctrines, political doctrines of the early 20th century, that's what they were based on. Eugenics, fascism, social Darwinism, they're all very, very tightly correlated. And I watched in horror as over the last 20 or 30 years, essentially these doctrines kind of captured not only politics, but also science, education, really all aspects of life. And I think this is where a lot of the problems are coming from, that it's no longer simply a competition because when people are not afraid for their livelihood, when they know they have things to eat, they have a roof over their head, then competition can be stimulating, right? We can compete for achieving greater things because we know that even if one person loses, basically the result is that hopefully a better idea won, right? But now, because of this ideology that has captured every aspect of life, the reality becomes that if I lose, I die, right? So clearly, every person out there has every incentive to fight for survival because of their fighting for the survival. They're basically clinging to their ideology, no matter how wrong even they themselves know it is. They basically know that they can't afford to lose, even if their ideology is wrong, even if they don't themselves believe in their ideology. And I think this is really dangerous slope because eventually we're going to get into a situation where truth doesn't really come to the surface. The only thing we see, the dominating ideas are really coming from the people who are the most willing to put violence and manipulation and lying as an effort in order for their ideas to propagate to the top. That's not a good recipe for truth. That's not a good recipe for progress. It eventually leads to stagnation, and if this continues for too long, eventually leads to war. I mean, if you look at how the really big wars, starting from the antiquity up until modernity started, it all came down to the world somehow got into a period of stagnation. Whether there weren't enough resources, or basically people were wanting to expand, and their own country wasn't enough for them anymore. So it was never really a good reason for war. And I don't need to convince anybody that war is not a good thing. But unfortunately, our modern culture is starting to propagate the idea that war is a good thing. It's almost like, again, survival of the fittest. So if you want to fight, and if you can beat the other guy, then you are perfectly justified in taking their resources and turning them into second-class citizens, so they basically work for you. That may work in war, but I don't think that's the way it should work in science, because science and progress depend on the truth, the right ideas coming to the top, right? And they also depend heavily on collaboration. If all you have is competition and war in science and a fight for survival, then I think it's pretty guaranteed that almost nobody is going to care about the truth. They're just going to care about making it through the day and feeding their family, and that's it. And they don't care how wrong the ideology they promote is. All they want to do is survive.
Absolutely. And I like to do like a little like side note here, because obviously when we talk about competition, we're not talking about like, I don't know, like play soccer,
Right.
or like a science competition where the kids are like trying to come up with something. It always has that connotation, like you said, of survival, of
Right.
fear or scarcity,
Mhm.
which many times they believe that there is a scarcity leads to the fear, that leads to the competition, to leads to this wrong thinking, because when you are like not thinking properly because you are under your fear, you cannot achieve the truth. You cannot really think properly, like you were saying. And
Right.
this whole thing about like you said it like so cleverly, like beating the other people, beating the other guy, even companies, we're all like told that you have to beat competition, right?
Right.
Let's say in the companies, Apple is trying to be these other guys and da 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 da, and it's just so hard to really find truth when
Yeah.
that happens, and it just happens everywhere in education. Kids are like, since the very little kids, they are feeling that pressure, that fear to get grades. Why?
Exactly.
Because they need to get in like the college, and if you
Right.
don't, you're not gonna get a job. So the whole system is based on this fearful idea.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've seen the movie Bowling for Columbine by Michael Moore. He won an Oscar for that movie in 2001.
I've
And it
seen
was
it.
it was the movie about the school shootings, right?
Hmm.
So many people don't like Michael Moore, but whether you like him or not, it doesn't matter. But the movie was about this core idea that he made it about American society, but he also talked about other Western societies too. And he said that many countries that really emphasize competition, the population in those countries lives under constant fear. And constant fear eventually has a really detrimental effect on your mental health. And that's what leads to eventually people breaking out into violence. Because if you're pushed into a corner, let's say like you were, I mean, he gave so many examples. You were a factory worker, you worked in a factory for 30 years, and then you have like one more week left for pension, but then your boss fires you 1 week before your pension, and now you don't get any more pension. I mean, that's an extreme example, but it has happened. Now, even the most normal and sane person, if they're in this situation, 30 years of hard work and barely getting enough money to survive, and suddenly you're told no more pension, you're on the street, and let's say you're 50, 60 years old, I think many people can see how somebody can lose their mind and start shooting people around them. I mean, a
Right.
person like this is not going to care about the world or the law
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
civilization or anything. And I think Michael Moore captured this paradigm very well, and he's saying that it's really partially the blame of the politicians because they rely on the system of fear. Because as long as people are afraid, they're not going to ask, is there a better way, right? If people are always afraid whether they're going to survive the next day, very few people have the time to sit down and say, look, this is not working. This is not good. We're becoming worse. Is there a better way? And if people start asking this question, the politicians are afraid. that some people will realize that many of the politicians are corrupt, they're stupid, some of them are criminals, some of them even worse, some of them molest children and things like that. So the politicians are afraid that they're not going to be in power anymore. So they're doing everything possible to keep the population, the general population, under constant fear or at the very least tension and anxiety.
Right. Well, the thing is like when you are like under tension, you are reactive,
Yeah,
so you only think short term,
yeah,
not long term, which is what politicians want, right?
yeah, exactly,
And
exactly.
that I wanted to like connect that with the idea of energy and health. And I have a quote here that you said recently: energy is important for life. It's obviously a simple statement, but has a lot of implications. So when we are like under fear, our energy levels are lower, and maybe you can speak to this.
Yeah.
So we don't like thrive really. We're not thinking properly with our energy systems. So what do you mean? Can you explain, talk to this, energy is important for life?
So basically, for a long time, there's been this battle in the medicine between two theories, two competing theories. One theory was the genetic theory, and basically said that, okay, so you eat to produce energy, right? Energy is important for life, but it's really the key, everything that determines your health, your life, your future is coded into your genes. So it's almost, so the people who defend that theory kind of saying that it really doesn't matter like how well you produce energy, because everything, how well you do in life is determined by your genes. So it doesn't matter how you interact with the environment. It doesn't matter what food you eat. You can smoke, drink, but if you have good genes, you'll be okay. And that's a very depressing theory, because it kind of means that you really, it doesn't matter what you do, right? You can do bad things, you can do good things, but at the end of the day, your life is predetermined.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another theory which says the exact opposite. I mean, it says, yes, you do inherit certain things from your parents, but basically the way your life, the quality of your life and how you interact with the world are determined by how much and how well you produce energy, how well you convert the food that you eat into energy. And that's going to determine, because energy, I mean, I think everybody realized that if you have a car that doesn't burn the fuel very well, or it doesn't have enough fuel, you're not going to get very far. Well, the analogy in the human version is that if you're not producing enough energy, everything from your world around you demands energy in order for you to interact with it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now me and I talking over Skype, right? You and I, this demands energy from both of us, right? So if we're talking over Skype and then suddenly your children run into the room and start yelling at you, and then the phone starts ringing and the emails start coming, eventually you'll reach a point where your energy that you're producing right now is not enough to cope with all of these things. So naturally, when you're in this state, when you feel like you don't have sufficient energy to cope with the environment, with everything that is around you, that's what I mean by environment, then naturally people start to try to eliminate certain things, right? Things that you feel you cannot deal with, right? You're going to ignore the email, you're going to try to ignore the children or ignore the phone call, right? But if these things continue and eventually you get into a situation where you cannot ignore certain challenges from the environment, it has been shown that people become violent because, I mean, the way the human mind perceives the outside world is as a challenge, right? And if you have challenges that your energy is sufficient to meet, then these challenges actually make you grow, make you develop, make you evolve, make you a better, smarter, nicer person. But if the challenges are too many, eventually you try to shrink your worldview so that you only have to deal with only a few challenges because your metabolic energy is just not enough, right? You
Mm-hmm.
cannot handle everything. And that's, I mean, this is still, it's not a good situation, but it's still tolerable, because if some of the challenges can be delayed, then that's okay. You can deal with them at a later time. But many of the challenges in today's world have been created in such a way that you cannot ignore them, right? So let's say the daycare is closed. Your children are at home. Children cannot be ignored because you're a parent. You cannot ignore your children. You cannot ignore paying your rent. You cannot ignore like
Mm-hmm.
going to work. So if you gather enough of these challenges that cannot be ignored, eventually the person, because you're so exhausted and your energy is not sufficient, eventually you get to a point where you want to shut the world off and say, enough, basta, I know I'm done, I don't want to deal with this anymore. But then if the work continues saying, no, 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 you have to deal with me because, oh, rent, you need to pay me, children, you need to feed me, right? Eventually it's been shown in many studies with animals and humans that eventually humans become violent because you interpret this as an assault. The challenge becomes an attack on you because the organism feels that these challenges are draining you and you simply cannot handle them. So anything that is a challenge that cannot be delayed and is taxing your energetic supply too
Hmm.
much, eventually the organism is going to start interpreting as a threat and will try to fight it physically.
Right, because we all have this program, right, to survive.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
think you're the one who shared with me these studies on the locust, this insect
Yeah,
that has the same genome, but it will express a different phenotype when it's under pressure, and it will
exactly.
become aggressive, and all these things, which is a really good analogy to what happens in our world. Can you identify some aspects in our society that lead to these perceived scarcity or pressure to keep us in this state of constant tension and fear, perhaps?
Yeah, I think the problem that we have nowadays economically is mostly coming from economics. It's the fact that the economy is controlled by a few very large companies, almost every branch of
Hmm.
the economy. If you
Hmm.
take agriculture, or if you take entertainment, or if you take food production, you basically there initially it seems like there's so many different companies providing product and service, but these companies are owned by other companies. And if you trace the ownership further way up, eventually it turns out that in every industry you have at most two or three major players who basically dominate that industry. And that's oligopoly, right? We know from economics that oligopoly typically doesn't lead to good outcomes because the large players, they don't like to compete because it drives their profits down. So they're going to find a way to collude with each other and basically keep the price as high as possible and limit the competition between themselves. But what they do is they're going to push this competition down to the clients, and then the clients, and they go, because they can control the price, they can create artificial scarcity, right? Now the food is still largely available, but if we can raise the price to a point where a decent percentage of the population is no longer able to afford it, effectively you've pushed that competition down to the population, and now a percentage of the people cannot eat. So basically, we're getting into a situation where either economics or politics is creating artificial scarcity, usually through pricing mechanisms. Sometimes they will just withhold directly whatever goods and services a person needs in order to have a fulfilling life. Housing is a huge problem in the United States. You can look at the crisis that's happening in San Francisco. Like over there, unless you really are a millionaire, you really cannot afford a house in San Francisco. You have to live 50, 60 miles outside of the city. Same thing is happening in New York City. DC is pretty close. So eventually, we're getting to a point where, there's an article in the Atlantic which said that the Western countries should be thought of as rich poor countries. In other words, there are many products here and services that are really cheaper than the third world countries. Like you can buy a decent iPhone, you can get like a nice TV. I mean, electricity and water are not that expensive, right? But the four fundamental things that determine largely the quality of life, which is food, housing, education, and health, are actually the most expensive of any other country in the world, specifically the
Hmm.
United States. But if you look at other Western developed countries like Canada, United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, over there, these four fundamental things that really life depends on them, so civilization, they're actually very, very expensive. So it turns out that, the things that really matter to our life are very expensive, so it creates tension for us. But at the same time, we're being told, oh, look at all this abundance. You have so many other things to choose from, and they're all cheap. Well, guess what? If you can afford to
Yeah.
send your children to school, it's not going to help you much that you can buy a really cheap and nice iPhone or really cheap and nice TV. Your children cannot eat the TV. They cannot educate. I mean, some people want children to be educated by TV, but we know that's not a good idea, right? So
Yeah.
eventually you get into a state where you have this society which at the surface looks like it's very rich, look like it's very abundant, but underneath there is this constant tension because the fundamental requirements for life are either extremely expensive or limited in an artificial way by basically either large companies or other
Yeah.
powers that have assumed this almost like a fascist entity, and they're trying to control the life of people mostly by controlling these four fundamental requirements.
Uh-huh. That's a really good point. And it's true that we get the perception here in the United States that there are so many choices. You go to the grocery store and they have
Uh,
like 20 different types of sodas,
uh,
but in reality then there are like only two parties to choose from, and things like that. So it's like, all right, really, how many options do I have in life?
Yeah.
And then I really like you brought up artificial scarcity. And basically there are two camps in terms of scarcity in the world. Like there's this group of people that think like we do have limited resources. There are so many people in the planet. It's overpopulated. We have to even go into less consumption and less and really like strap our like belts and stuff like that. And then on the other side, there are people that think like we actually have the technology to to get most of the things for free, including energy and food and all these things. I tend to be more on that side. I believe there is like some interest, like you said, those companies, few companies that, and there is evidence to these that have purchased like patents and things like that, inventions that could have like free the world, and they keep us, like I said, in that state of scarcity, and always many times they threaten us through environmental concerns and things
Yeah.
like that. So can you speak a little bit to that, and maybe what is your thinking?
So I recently read an article about the fear of overpopulation, right? I mean, you hear this on TV all the time. The world is overpopulated. We need to control population growth. I mean, I think for 50 years, China had like a policy of every family is only allowed to have one child, right? And
Right.
that was the primary reason is that the United Nations basically went to China and convinced it and said, look, you have to stop having children because you cannot feed this entire population. The country cannot produce enough, doesn't have enough resources. So China did this for a while, but over time, people who study demographics and basically people who study logistics and natural resource consumption came to the conclusion that really that isn't true. I mean, the only reason we have a situation where a large country cannot feed its population is by somehow creating artificial scarcity. So there was an article which I can send you later after the call, which looked at the population problem and said, you can actually take the entire population of the world and comfortably, I emphasize comfortably, settle them in the state of Texas. So the state of Texas alone can handle about 7 billion people, and they're going to have a density, population density, about the same density as it is right now in Washington, D.C. Now, it's not too
Wow.
dense, right? I mean, there are places in
No, it's
Bangladesh and
livable. It's
India
livable.
is livable, exactly. And they said also, well, what about feeding them? What about giving water? And they said, okay, so food-wise, so Texas may not be enough, but if you add next to Texas, if you add the neighboring states like Oklahoma, right, and maybe New Mexico, these two states, just adding them to Texas is enough again to feed and house the entire population of the world. If you don't allow for these oligopolies to form. Now we got into the so now we know that really the population problem really comes down to some kind of an economic reason. And I've been looking at this. There's a person who founded PayPal. His name is Peter Thiel,
Yep.
and he's been noticing the same things that you and I have noticed. And he's saying, what is going on here? Why is the world seem to be not progressing, but we seem to be regressing? And he thinks that the issue is that we haven't really had any kind of a scientific breakthrough since the early 20th century. He said, look at everything around you. Look at airplanes. Look at cars. Look at the physics and chemistry that make life possible. All of these things around us, with the exception of the internet, that's the only
It's
exception.
the same stuff.
They're based on theories like theory of relativity and things that were discovered more than 100 years ago, right? Einstein published his theory of relativity in 1905. So it's been 115 years already. So he's saying in economics, in order for economics to work, in order for capitalist society to work, you have to have two things. So basically, you have to have either increasing profit or decreasing cost of production. Now, cost of production only decreases if there is scientific advantage, if there's advance, right? If the science keeps advancing, you can have cheaper energy, you can have cheaper means of production. So that's what really keeps things going, because the entire economy has to make some kind of a profit. Otherwise, a capitalist society cannot survive. So because we haven't had any scientific progress, the only way for the companies to keep basically surviving in this environment, they have to keep increasing the profits, right? Because this margin between cost and between the profit margin has to be like a positive number, because there's also inflation. So he's saying, so in order for this profit to exist, You either have to increase your profit margin or you have to decrease the cost of production. If you can decrease the cost of production, well, you can, but we haven't been doing it. That's his point. He's saying after the end of the Cold War, the governments around the world have no incentive to invest in basic science. So they kind of gave this up. They gave this activity. They gave it to the private sector. But the private sector really doesn't have much of an incentive to do long-term investment into things that discover basic laws of the universe. Like, so for example, a government can afford to pour billions of dollars for a project that's going to take 20 years because they can afford it. They're not chasing profit. They're chasing results, right? They're chasing the advancement of science, the improvement of mankind. But a private company doesn't operate this way. They operate on the basis of quarterly profits. If you can, it's very hard to convince your shareholders if you're a private company. It doesn't matter if you're publicly traded or privately held. But if you're a private ownership company, very hard to convince your shareholders to keep accepting a loss for 20 years and maybe nothing comes out of it, right? Maybe it will not work out.
Right.
Companies are not going to accept that. So Peter Thiel is basically claiming that the model of capitalism and private enterprise cannot work in science. It cannot, because it's just the cost model is very different and the incentives are very different. And now he's saying, look what happened when we applied the capitalist model to science. All of these scientists now they have a career, right? They don't want to get fired, right? They want to maintain their job. They want to feed their families. So it created a situation, a paradigm which is called publish or perish. In other words, it's very famous among people who are in academia. So you have to publish a certain amount of studies every year, or you will get kicked out. I mean, you can also get fired. You're no longer a scientific person who sits there and creates great ideas and nobody's really worrying about you or your salary. You're on a salary and you have to deliver results. If you don't, you get fired. So this led to the situation where people are now starting to publish fake results just because they have to meet the quota of publications. And it's becoming a problem in every aspect of science, chemistry, physics, biology, medicine, everywhere. And just like I said, this fear for their livelihood and their job is pushing people, because the science adopted a capitalist model or even the fascist model at this point. It's pushing people to do this. It's not really science. I mean, I don't know what to call it, but it's basically politics, and they're disguising it as science. And Peter Thiel is saying this cannot work. In order for this world to survive, first we have to get economics out of the academia. It doesn't work that way, right? I mean, you cannot apply this model. And second thing, he says we have to restart the investment in basic science, because without progress in science and technology, eventually, even the companies now, they keep rising the prices, right, in order to maintain the profit. Eventually, this is going to reach a wall, because if the economy is not growing properly, eventually, if you're not creating new jobs, eventually there's not going to be enough money to keep increasing the profit. So people will just stop buying. Eventually everybody will be priced out. So the company will also go bankrupt, because you cannot increase prices indefinitely. So he's saying the only thing that can save us is we have to restart the progress in fundamental science.
You said like a key quote here from him, get economics out of academia.
Yeah.
And you also recently said in our podcast that big scientists like Einstein and all these people that really like came with breakthroughs with new ideas, they are left alone. Yep. They are not forced to produce, and they have enough resources, which is another way of saying get economics out of academia. To me, it's huge, this idea of like having a system in place that allows people, and not just scientists, but entrepreneurs and even like students, like kids, out of this rat race, you've heard that term before.
Rat race, yes, yes.
Trying to survive, because a scientist that needs to produce something, it has to stick with the status quo of, hey, if I don't say this, they are not going to give me the money. So
of course, yeah.
Same with pharmaceutical companies and all these things. Having those monopolies, they are going to guarantee that the research that comes out is going to be basically the same things. Exactly. So who's going to come up with a new idea that has no funding? I mean, it's not going to happen.
Exactly.
So everything really at the end of the day comes down to economics. And I want to say one thing, And it's this idea that in economic theory, we have Adam Smith, right? He's the father of capitalism in a way. He said like the invisible hand, right? The invisible hand. You as long as you try to get your interest, your primary interest, and you achieve that, at the end of the day, the invisible hand will benefit everyone.
But
And this other
here's one key
guy,
difference. One key
more or less,
difference.
that's the idea, right?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Adam Smith, many people quote Adam Smith on this invisible hand, but he also said something else. Adam Smith said that the invisible hand should always be moderated by morality. So he said it is subject to restraint. He said that the invisible hand method is taken too far. Eventually, it can backfire. It can cause problems. So he thought that unlimited greed is a problem. Now, he said by looking after your own interest, he meant the satisfaction of your basic needs and maybe a little bit of profit. Now, of course, this little bit of profit can be a very vague concept. You know, you can be stretched, right? But he had an entire chapter in which he said the invisible hand is a great mechanism, but there has to be a mechanism of either self-moderation or a moderation from the outside. And if you cannot control your greed, your own greed, then something from the outside has to control it. Otherwise, it can ruin the game for everybody. And that's what we're kind of seeing right now. These large companies like the oligopolies are controlling the game, and there's nobody that can actually control their greed. So they're violating even the principle of Adam Smith.
Okay, that's a really good, important connotation to share. And to me, it's the same thing as saying like John Nash, this other guy came later, is a mathematician. Maybe you've seen that movie, The Beautiful Mind. He said
Game
like
theory.
Adam Smith, right, Adam Smith said like this, but really the best outcome comes when you search for your own benefit and also taking into consideration others, which is the same thing that you were saying, or Adam Smith was saying initially. Hey, morality means like, hey, search for your benefit, but don't encroach, don't like do it at the expense of others. And as long as you can do that, then everything's gonna go well. But that's the problem now is that we have companies and individuals like going for the benefit, thinking that that's the right thing to do at any cost.
At any cost, exactly.
And at any cost, and that's the problem that we're facing.
And they're pushing the cost to others, right? They're saying, "Oh, I'm going to get my profit." I mean, we already faced this in 2008 and 2009. I'm sure you've heard of the idea privatized profits but socialized losses, right? So the bank basically, all the big banks that almost failed, they basically went to the government and said, "Look, we made some bad judgments. We gave loans to many people that shouldn't be given loans. We gave mortgages, right? So here's the deal: you have to bail us out. Otherwise, we're going to ruin the entire country. If we crash, the entire economy goes under." And then the government said, "Okay, we're going to save you." And then when they saved them, the banks still actually got to keep the profit. So it became a really perverse mechanism. Nice. Basically, you can do whatever you want to get profit, but if your plan doesn't work out, you essentially say, "Oh, you know what? The bank or whatever organization is, we're not going to deal with the loss. We're going to push it down to shareholders, to government, to taxpayers, whoever it is, but not us." The problem is we're all interconnected. So when you push the loss to somebody else, eventually it actually hurts even these banks that they thought that they kept the profit. But guess what? If your shareholders, if your clients, if the taxpayer, if these people have to eat the loss, they're going to have less resources to give to you, right? The purpose of the bank is to create assets. And if you push the loss on other people, these people are not going to have they're going to have less assets, and then you're going to have poorer customers. So in the long scheme of things, the bank weren't better off. So it's really a sick, a very perverse idea. But because everybody's chasing short-term profits, the quarterly profits, they basically they don't care. The CEO wants to get his bonus or her bonus, and then after a few years they leave. So that's all they care about, and you know they basically leave society to handle the losses on its own.
Right, absolutely right. And here's the thing also, that we always push like the blame on like companies and the government, but here's the thing: if we demanded from the companies that people, you and I, individuals, invest in, that we demanded like, hey, triple bottom line. We cannot have a company just be preoccupied with the short-term profit and destroying the Amazon at the same time, you know. We have to consider like society impacts, environmental impacts. And if people that are like buying, let's say in the S&P, 500, investing for their retirement, had the mindset, everything will change too. Because the problem is like people just buy whatever they want to secure their retirement, what their financial advisor tells them to do, regardless of what the company is doing.
Yeah.
And that's also shameful, because honestly, like, people have to take responsibility. I'm not going to buy stocks from a company that I'm not sure they are doing the right thing for the world, and not just about like looking at the money, because these companies need to look at the triple bottom line. What are they doing to society?
Yeah.
And if everybody change that too, they will be like, whoa, companies then will be forced, the invisible hand will be like acting, it will be, companies will be forced to, hey, now the stakeholders are demanding this. We have to stay taking care of the people in China or the environment here and there. And the problem is that nobody cares because everybody's short term. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? I hope it makes sense.
It does, yeah, it makes sense. And I think the financial advisors are also to blame a little bit, because when you go to a financial advisor, most of them would just take the balance sheet of the company and they're going to go over the fundamentals and say, oh, look, this is a healthy company. You should invest in this company, right? And that's how they build your portfolio. The problem is that nobody knows now how to calculate the risk of this company going under or going bankrupt, because they have an unsustainable model of greed. Because so far the assumption always is, oh, more greed equals better. No, Peter
Bigger, better.
Thiel,
Bigger is better.
exactly. Peter
Uh-huh.
Thiel and Adam Smith and many other people, even outside of them, said, look, if you don't moderate this greed, eventually it gets into this perverse system where a few people collect all the money and they think they're okay because they push the loss to everybody else. But we're all interconnected. Eventually, even those companies that are successful, even they will go bankrupt because they depend on others in order to thrive. And this needs to change, because the mindset needs to be, okay, yes, profit is important. We need to be over water in order to be alive, right? But it doesn't, I mean, if you have a long-term goal and it's a promising goal, it should be something that's built into the company policy to pursue, right? If the shareholders approve it. But right now, the way it's done is there's only one thing that matters, is the quarterly profit. And somehow people think that, just like you said, when because everybody's under stress, everybody's under tension, you're being reactive. And chasing quarterly profit is the perfect example of being reactive. There is no strategy. Now, usually the job of the CEO is to come up with a strategy. But if you look at their plans for most of the CEOs, some of them publish their agenda and basically what they plan to do with the company. Most of the plans really don't go more than a year in advance. I mean, they basically plan one big merger, maybe lay off 20% of the workforce. It's always things like that, and it's always about a year in advance. I have not seen a company that has laid out a plan that says, here's what we want to be doing 5 years from now. Here's what we want to be doing 10 years from now, 20 years from now. These things used to be routine. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that's how the government and the public companies operated. They were publishing their plan and their agendas for decades to come, right? And now, doesn't mean that all of this will come to will materialize. Doesn't mean it will actually happen. But it was demonstrating that the companies cared about these things, and they were actually putting budget towards chasing long-term goals. Right now, none of this exists anymore. Maybe the government has some long-term goals, but they're usually related to military. Now, even the government actually, the government is kind of scaling down its forecast. They used to have price predictions for oil, for the common goods that people consume to survive, on which the consumer price index is based. The National Bureau of Economic Research, which is an independent government agency, I think was created by Congress. And basically, they used to publish these things for 10, 20, and 30 years. Right now, if you go to their website, they may have projections for 5 years in the future, but that's it. So even they are becoming very short-term oriented, and I think it's a sign of how short-sighted society and reactive society has become, and it's really not a good sign. If we want to thrive, we have to care about the future. Thriving, really,
Right.
the very word thrive means to get better, right? And to get better means it implies that the future will be an improvement. And if you only focus on the short term, if you're only reactive, there is no concept of future at all. So it doesn't make sense to even talk about thriving, and we have to change that.
Definitely. Well, we talk about some of these risks that we have in our society. But speaking of thriving, what opportunities do you see now to change the tide, to be able to thrive with a long-term plan for our society? What do you see?
So there are very few industries that are left where a person can really be like left alone and make enough money to basically pursue their hobbies. I mean, you mentioned that Einstein and Bohr and Dirac and many of the great physicists of the 20th century, many of them were not professional scientists. They actually had other jobs, right? They were doing these things as like a hobby, it's like something that they like to do. And in order for us to restart this process, the same thing needs to happen nowadays. People need to have some time to pursue their own ideas. Now, Google, when Google first started, they actually had this great idea, which is not theirs. It started from a company called 3M. They make the yellow notes that you post on the wall. They're a big company, and the company 3M in the 1970s they started a project. It was called the 20% rule, and this means 20% of your work time in the company, you're allowed to do whatever you want, to work on a project that you want. I mean, it doesn't mean you can go play golf.
Can you say that again? Can you repeat that? What is the concept?
It's called the 20% rule.
Uh-huh.
So, and because most people back in the 70s, they work 5 days a week, 20% of 5 days is 1 day, right?
Okay.
So basically the way 3M was doing things is like every employee in the company was allowed to choose 1 day of the week, and they spend this day of the week working on their own projects, anything they want, anything. And I mean, I don't mean go play golf, right? I don't mean go and drink in a bar. I mean work on a project that you like. You came up with an idea, perfect. And you can use company resources to work on that, right? So the company quickly realized some of the best inventions of the company, including these yellow sticky notes that you put on the wall. These products actually came as a result of people working on the 20% rule. Most of the products that the company has nowadays are all the result of the 20% rule. So Google looked at that and said, we want to implement the same thing. And Google had this rule, the 20% rule, from 1999 until 2011. So for about 12 years. And most of Google's great products, like so the search engine came from the two founders who actually did it as a graduate hobby project in Stanford. It wasn't part of their work. It wasn't part of their thesis. It was something they just wanted to do for fun. And also some of the great Google products like Gmail, right? Google Voice, Google Wave, the Google Documents, all of these things came as a result of people working on the 20% rule. Now, for some reason, Google decided that giving people 20% work time to do whatever they want was too much. At some point, Google, if you remember, Google used to have this motto. It said, "Don't be evil," right? Google was basically saying one of the mottos of the company was, "We're not evil," right? We want to do good in the world. After they removed the 20% rule in 2011, they also removed that rule from the website. So now they kind of say we are evil, right?
We'll do whatever it takes
to get the profit,
to get that quarter like balance sheet.
Exactly. But it shows you that, see, these large companies showed and proved to the world that if you let people work on what they want, even 20% of their time, that's not much.
Yeah.
It results in great products that then these companies then took and monetized and created a huge amount of profit. So if you're a smart company, right? I mean, you can think of the 20% rule as you invest money and you don't know if something is going to come out of this or not, right? That's the risk. But if something comes out of it, and so far in every single case, good results came from this 20% rule. The loss that you endure by allowing people to work 20% of the time is completely offset by the massive profit that these two products generated. So it shows that it works, and you don't have to invest for 20, 30 years. You can even do it something like very, very, very convenient. You have on a daily basis. Say 1 day of the week, do what you want.
Yeah, and I while you were explaining this thing, I remember this TED Talk that I think speaks specifically of this. And I think I remember this company in Australia or something. They were even like giving them like wine and just basically throwing a party,
Yeah.
because people are happy, and when you're happy and relaxed, you can be more creative. But when you're stressed out and trying to, I need to come up with this, there's no way that you're going to be creative or come up with a new idea. So
you come up with a trick. When you're under stress, you come up with tricks to game the system, to cheat the system, so that the system leaves you alone. That's the
But
only
no,
thing that
but no innovation. You're
no
right. But no
innovation,
innovation.
no
You
innovation.
would see, oh, how can we can cost? Maybe we should ship these jobs to China or here and there, but no true innovation like disruptive things.
Exactly,
And because
exactly.
for that, the mind needs to be relaxed. And
Yeah.
we go back all the way to the beginning of the conversation when we said like, we're still stuck in this technology and most people live under tension and not thriving because we're preoccupied, we're under fear, the energy, the brain takes a lot of energy to be creative too, right?
Yeah.
So
Forty
it's
percent
just,
of our metabolic energy, 40% of the energy is consumed by the brain. And then actually, since we're already talking about the metabolic energy, it has been shown that as soon as the world starts throwing too many things at you, as soon as the world starts creating tension for you, basically because the brain consumes so much energy, but now you need this energy for other things. Maybe you need to run, you need to survive somehow, you need to worry about, you need to react. The brain basically starts shutting down specific areas of the brain that consume too much energy. And one of the first areas that will be shut down is the area of creativity. It's located in the hypothalamus. So basically, I'm sorry, it's located in the frontal lobe. So as soon as you start becoming under tension, the brain says, "Oops, I cannot afford to be creative right now."
fight or flight,
Exactly.
fight or flight.
Fight or flight. Yes. I need to survive. So forget about creativity. Forget about painting a painting or coming up with a new music. This is not important right now because if I don't survive, I'll die. So and that's what the system has become. It's created us it created an environment that we're always in the fight or flight, which means that we almost never have the time to turn on the creative part of the brain.
Do you believe universal basic income could be something that will help at least to go in that direction, to
I
free
think it
and
can.
help?
Yes, I think it can, but it has to be implemented wisely because it can, if it's done in the wrong way, it can create an environment where. So here's the thing. So communism was a little bit like that, right? Everybody was guaranteed a job, and actually, I come from a former communist country. I'm from Bulgaria originally. So Bulgaria, Soviet Union, the Eastern European countries, they had a system where everybody was required to work. Actually, and then also everybody was guaranteed to have a job. Everybody was guaranteed to have a house. Everybody was guaranteed to have food. So your basic requirements were guaranteed by the government. Now, if you push this idea here, most of the people who have the capitalist mindset said, "Oh, this is terrible. It's going to create parasites," right? But no, the communists actually said, if you're healthy, you have to work. You cannot just sit on your butt all day and drink
Hmm.
beer, right? I mean, so if you don't want to work, then you go to a government commission and they have to do a health exam. And if you have some kind of a problem like a mental health problem or physical problem, of course, then they realize you're not capable of working the way a healthy person will work. So they will try to help you out, right? So they recognize that if a person is not healthy, you cannot force them to work. And if you only give them money, they will never get out of this sickness, right? You have to do something to help them more. I mean, sometimes, it could be drugs, could be surgery, could be therapy, could be creating like a supportive network because maybe some person, their family died, right? And now they're so depressed, the only way to get them out of this depression is to replace the family with something else.
So you're
So
saying that money is obviously not enough. We also have to take care of the mental aspect, the health of the person,
and the
because a
communal
healthy
aspect
person.
and the
Okay,
communal aspect, they
I
have to
I
give
agree
people purpose.
absolutely.
So you give
I
money,
agree
but you also
absolutely.
give purpose. If you only
Okay.
give money, the people that don't have purpose are going to stay in that state and say, okay, thank you, give me the money, and then they will not progress. They will sit
Right.
there. Maybe they will do less crime, right? But they're
Right.
not going to be productive members of society. If you want them to be, you give them the
I
money so they're not afraid anymore. But you also give them a sense of purpose and community so that they feel desire to do something. And
right.
so
And
that's
I think
why, yeah,
a healthy person normally, it's a person that wants to do something, that wants to
exactly,
help. The
exactly.
problem is that we have a lot of people in our societies that are not healthy.
Yeah,
And then others say, well, if we just give them money, people are lazy. No, people are not lazy, but a lot of people are sick and
yeah,
they don't have the community support. So if we have like a healthier lake, the fish are going to be also thriving and healthier. And money doesn't resolve all the problems, but sometimes it can like free some time and free some space to start at least going into the direction of health, more health. Because
yeah,
at the end of the day, like you said, is energy, it's health. We go back to that idea. If you had to choose, if you could choose any person from our history, alive or also already like the passed away, to be the president, of the new world, and we know that presidents don't have all the power and they cannot do whatever they want, but who will be that person and why?
Probably be the Greek philosopher Aristotle,
Uh-huh.
because he's the one who, based on his philosophy, all of the ideas about energy, quantum physics, and really how reality works. He's the one who started the whole paradigm, the whole idea, right? He talks
Mhm.
about the potential and actuality, and the potential being converted to actuality. And in order for this to happen, everything requires energy, right? If let's say every child has the potential to be a world-class athlete, right?
Mhm.
But whether they become a world-class athlete or not depends on whether they will have the energy to achieve it. Everything comes down to energy. And so basically, he's the one who saw the fundamental importance of energy in everything, including humans, right? So I think he'll be my personal choice. And he also realized that there are limitations, right? For example, he said, okay, look, if you were born with a really bad, like a badly damaged face, and or you're missing a leg or an arm, life will be hard. Let's not make any excuses and claim that like that this person will have an easy life. No, this person will have a hard life, but we can improve it, right? Because and he's the one who said that with energy you can mitigate most of the problems in the world, and for many people you can solve them completely. Right now, the attitude for most people is, oh, either let's give money to everybody because this is the solution, or let's kill all the weak ones or let them die, and then we preserve only the good ones, and that's how the world works. Neither one of these options is sufficient. One of them is
Mhm.
cruel and is basically regressing. We're going back to the jungle where there is real scarcity, right? And in modern society there isn't real scarcity. It's all artificially manufactured scarcity for profit, right? Or you go into the other extreme, which they call communism, which is let's give everybody money, and then the world will be a beautiful place. No, if you give resources to a poor, sick, or violent person, they can actually do more damage, right? It's giving a child a gun. It can do a lot of damage. It's a
Yeah.
powerful thing. So
Mhm.
it's Aristotle which said that you need to give the resources to the person that needs them, but and you also need to monitor and you need to participate in this person's life and make sure that he realizes what he has received and that he has a sense of purpose. And if that person doesn't have a sense of purpose, you need to spend efforts on creating that, because otherwise there's no solution, right? Otherwise, the only other solution is just what the capitalists are proposing: let these people die. And Aristotle thought that's a bad thing. He said that every person has the potential to do great things if you put them in the right environment. So
Mhm.
he's the only person that I have read about that realized the importance of environment and the importance of all people being connected, that the health
Mhm.
and happiness of other people is very important for your own. You cannot only worry about yourself. You have to look at everybody as being part of one big reality, one big whole connected. And then, of course, maybe you're a little bit selfish. You first take care of yourself, but you also take care of the others as much as you can. It's
Mhm.
the same concept in Adam Smith. So we've been seeing this concept of, yes, make sure you're okay, but take care of others. So it seems to have been going in the world all the way up until maybe about the mid 20th century, like the Second World War, which is when these fascist ideas, I mean, many people think, okay, Hitler was defeated, so the fascism is over. No, fascism is not over. Fascism actually moved to some
Other
Latin
forms.
American countries. Yeah, some of it came to the United States. Some of it stayed in
Mhm.
Spain, in Italy. In some Mediterranean countries, Malta is like a very, very big hotbed of fascism. So fascism never went away. There is always a group of people who think that the solution to the problem is kill everything that bothers you, and then the world will be a better place. I don't think that's a solution. There will always be things that bother you. The solution
Mhm.
is make sure you have enough energy to deal with a challenge. And if you have enough energy, these things that bother you will actually become stimulating. They will not bother you anymore, but there will be a challenge and a problem that you will want to solve. And that's what we
Right.
need to be striving towards, changing the environment so that it's stimulating instead of crushing, and making sure that the people who don't have any resources, They're given some resources so that they don't feel like they're about to die every day, right? And finally, make sure we give them a sense of purpose, and if they need help, maybe try to improve their health as well. But usually it's been shown that if you give people good diet, if you don't stress them out, right? And if you give them a sense of purpose, they're actually pretty good at recovering. You don't have to
Right.
go and treat everybody individually. They can actually recover spontaneously on their own, at least most of them.
And the sense of purpose is huge, and that's also where the cooperative cooperation paradigm comes in, because like you were saying, we need to contribute, we need to realize we are like interconnected, we're part of something bigger, and it's not just about personally thriving, but at some time when you have enough energy, you have to realize, okay, now I can go into the environment and try to help people, try to fix it for the good of everyone.
Yeah.
Um, if you had to choose one book or one documentary, that you had to, that everybody had to watch or read, mandatory, let's say before they can vote or something like that. I know that's controversial. Everybody has a right to vote right away, and that's another topic for another day. But if you had to make one book or one documentary, which one and why?
I will probably ask them to read. There's a book was published in the 1970s. It's called Cold War in Biology.
Uh-huh.
And that book is about biology, but it's also about politics, it's about economics, it's about life in general. And it kind of demonstrates how for the last 3,000 years in the world, there have always been two ideas that are battling for dominance. One idea, which I said at the beginning, is the genetics idea, or
Uh-huh.
the idea of Plato, who said that, the world that we see around us doesn't matter. Like it's not a real world. The real world is behind it, and it's based on these idealized shapes like a triangle, rectangle, a circle. And the modern idea of these Platonic forms, Platonic shapes, is the idea of genetics. And the geneticists people have the same idea. They basically say, look, your specific body or the way you interact with the environment or everything you do or eat and whatnot, it doesn't matter. You're based on you're the result of this information which is encoded in your genes. So if you were born with good genes, good for you. If you're born with bad genes, bad for you. And there is nothing you can do to change this in a large measure. Maybe a little bit, but by and large, everything your fate is fixed. And then the other idea was the idea of Aristotle. Aristotle said that everything changes. Everything is in a constant state of flux, that you and the environment cannot be separated. You're one and the same. So everything that happens to the environment reflects on you, and everything that happens inside of you also reflects on the environment and other people. So everything affects everything else simultaneously and continuously. So what you do with your life and every choice you make matters tremendously. So, and basically they showed how these two ideas dominated medicine up until the 1970s when this book was published, and actually they continue to dominate today. I mean, you see my podcast with Danny, they're mostly about the difference between the genetic theory and the metabolic theory, and discussing studies that show that you can cure some of these terrible diseases by improving the production of energy, which is the metabolic theory, the theory of change. So if we have to call them the two ways, the Platonic idea, the genetic idea, is the theory of stasis, the theory of nothing moving, nothing changing. And the theory of Aristotle, the theory of constant motion, it's also a theory of another philosopher, Heraclitus, who lived before Aristotle. Everything is in motion, everything is in flux, everything is always flowing. It's the theory of constant change, of always, there is a change always. And that change requires energy. So ensure there
Mm-hmm.
is enough energy, and everything, and most of the problems disappear. So you cannot rely on something that you inherited from your parents, and then you can sit on your butt all day and do nothing because you will be okay if you had the good genes, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
not how the world works. And I think most people intuitively agree that you'll have to do things. Otherwise, your life is not going to progress. There has to
Mm-hmm.
be, you need to constantly be doing things to improve your life and improve the life of others. And that requires energy. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that book captures it very well. It basically presents the difference between the two ideas and how
Uh-huh.
political the game became, because the Western world adopted the ideas of Plato and the ideas of genetics around the beginning of the 20th century. And then Europe, Eastern Europe, kind of continued with the ideas of change, right? And then these two scientific ideas became almost like the scientists started publishing these articles trying to prove each other wrong because it was a political thing, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in the United States, like the president will sometimes even call the scientists at like NASA or like a big university they're working on some kind of a experiment, and he will say, "Remember, the result of your experiment affects not only medicine, it affects the dominance of our country in the world, the dominance of our ideas in the world." So these scientists already knew, and I think that's what started it. They already knew that they're no longer scientists; they're actually politicians. Their
Uh-huh.
work is used for political purpose. Same thing happened
Wow.
in the Eastern Bloc, in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would call scientists and actually tell them, this is what you need to produce, this is what you need to publish, right? And
Mm-hmm.
these things became a political fight, an economic fight, and a
Mm-hmm.
scientific fight. And that's one of the best books that I've seen that discusses how these ideas have ruled the world for the last 4,000 years and what happens when you go too much into the direction of one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Man, the rabbit hole is deep, you know.
Yeah, it is.
The book is Cold War in Biology,
Cold
and
War. Yeah.
for those, okay, and then I only have a few more minutes. I know I want to be mindful of your time, even though this is so much fun for me, and I could talk all day long. You talk about knowledge, and you say that in order to change society, basically this is your idea. I've heard we had to increase knowledge. Do you believe that maybe psychedelics could play a role? You have a tweet recently, I think, on LDS or LSD, sorry,
LSD, LSD.
Alzheimer. But do you think that there are some psychedelics that could help us to understand things in different ways, be more creative, and maybe bring more knowledge to affect change in the world?
Absolutely. So there's this branch of science called anthropology, right? So and also
Mm-hmm.
archaeology, and these people have found that every culture around the world that they have studied use some kind of a mind-altering substance. So for most cultures, it's alcohol, but for some cultures, especially in Latin America, it's not alcohol. It's either mushrooms, peyote or whatever they call it, right? Or some other, or like cocaine from the coca leaf, right? So every culture that has been studied so far was using some kind of a substance to change the way they perceive the world. And it has been shown, I'm sure you know, the Romans said in vino veritas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they many people think that, oh, I guess they were saying that we should be drinking wine because wine is really the meaning of life. No, they meant something else.
Mm-hmm.
They meant two things. One, that when a person is drunk, they usually try to
Tell the truth.
tell the truth. Number one. Number two, when a person is drunk, they're usually capable of they're much more open-minded and they're
Uh-huh.
capable of perceiving the world. It is distorted, but it's much more real than when a person is sober. When a
Mm-hmm.
person is sober, you try to be too logical because
Mm-hmm.
that's how we've been raised by schools and society and education is you go from A, from B to C to D, and you don't question, even if you see there is another option, you've been told, look, you have limited resources. Again, we're coming back to the energy. Use your energy to go through the established path and don't waste too much energy because you don't have much. Don't waste it on trying to try different options. When you're drunk, you're actually doing things spontaneously, much more
Mm-hmm.
spontaneously. And the results that come out of this activity, you're much more likely, much more open-minded, and much more likely to build knowledge based on them. So, but alcohol is actually is probably not the best substance for that because it has some unpleasant side effects. It can actually inhibit memory formation, right? So even if you learn something great when you're drunk, you may forget it, and then the next morning everything's gone. You don't remember what your experience was.
Mm-hmm.
So they found out that these psychedelic substances, the mushrooms, DMT, LSD, a number of different hallucinogenic chemicals, they basically, the way they work was similar to alcohol, but they worked only on the mind, and they work by blocking our ability to filter. So when information comes from the outside world, just like I said, because when we're sober, we're told to be logical. We try to filter and remove a lot of the information that's coming in. We say this is not relevant. It doesn't help me achieve my goal, right? This is or this is I cannot worry about this right now because I don't have resources. Well, the psychedelics remove that ability of ours to block things. So we basically there's all the information that's coming from the world. Our brain is capable of perceiving, and coming up with new ideas, with new knowledge based on the information coming from the
Mm-hmm.
outside. And
Uh-huh.
most of the great scientists of the 20th century have admitted that at some point in their life
Ah.
they've used either LSD
Hey.
or one of the other hallucinogenics. And some of the greatest writers like Hemingway, he actually loved to drink a drink called absinthe.
Oh
Um,
yeah, that's really strong.
yeah, and it's
Yeah.
also if you drink the real drink absinthe, it actually contains a worm and it's hallucinogenic too. So it's
Oh.
basically it's almost like you have LSD. But when Hemingway was writing it, there was no LSD at the time, so he was using whatever was available, and to him
Uh-huh.
it was absinthe.
Uh,
But yes, these psychedelic substances allow us to remove our logical barrier and then accept the world as it comes to us without any judgment. We just look the
mm-hmm.
way things they are and
Mm-hmm.
try to come up with knowledge based on that without saying, oh, this is irrelevant, this is irrelevant. No, take everything in and then decide what to leave and what not to what to retain and what to discard. When you're too logical, when your barrier is here, some things don't even come through. They get filtered out from the very beginning. They don't even reach your brain.
Because you have also your programming, your filters, so you're
Exactly.
not taking reality as what it is.
Exactly.
So in a way, meditation is just one way to be more mindful
Exactly.
and to remove those filters, take things the way they are, period. So I guess you're giving me a good idea for giving me good ideas for tonight. We're recording this on New Year's Eve, so
Yes. Good.
maybe
Good.
we
Good.
should try some of those.
Maybe.
Uh, One more like quote is one of my favorite quotes, and I would like you to maybe give some thoughts on these by Buckminster Fuller. What a thinker that guy was. Is this one about you never change things by fighting the existing reality. You change something, but to change something, you build a new model that makes the previous model obsolete. And that was said by Buckminster Fuller. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it captures very well how the world works, and it illustrates why the current society environment is not working. We're being told to, just like I said, you can't fight reality, right? You have to take it, incorporate it, and come up with a new idea, right, that incorporates the current reality and gives an opportunity for a new reality to come in later. Right now, the way science and society and politics and culture work is we're being told, here is the right idea. Everything that doesn't agree with this idea is automatically considered wrong and it's being discarded. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a terrible thing because it assumes that the right answer is only one answer and it never changes. But change, if you believe in Aristotle, if you believe in Adam Smith, change is a fundamental part of this world, and knowledge needs to be constantly updated and accumulated and incorporated in order for the world to progress, in order for the knowledge to progress. Because otherwise you become stuck with this old idea and reality then changes, and instead of accepting the new reality, you say, nope, what I'm seeing is not real, this is illusion, I'm going to continue to stick with my idea. And we're seeing some of the best examples in medicine where in that post about Alzheimer's and LSD, I think you've seen it, they've been trying to cure Alzheimer's for the last 40 years or even 50 years by basing the tests and the drugs on the idea that Alzheimer is caused by accumulation of this protein in the brain called beta amyloid, or there's another protein called tau. And they've come up with so many different drugs that have been shown to remove these proteins very well. They clean the brain, right? But the patients don't improve. And in many cases, they actually become worse. So they've poured maybe at least $100 billion trying to cure Alzheimer's based on this wrong idea, instead of accepting the result after 2, 3, 4 trials with humans. If things are not working, then maybe you should be thinking, okay, maybe my idea that the Alzheimer is caused by this protein, maybe it's not right. Maybe I need to look for something else. But because so much money was thrown into this, and the mentality here, I mean, the modern world is that, oh, if we get an idea, we have to stick to an idea. We don't change an idea. This is a sign of weakness, right? This is actually a political idea. In politics, you stick to what you promise and you never change it, right? But in science, that's not how it works, because nobody knows the absolute truth and the world is
Right.
constantly changing. So if you try certain things and they don't work, a good scientist will try something else. But because
Mm-hmm.
science became politics, we don't see that anymore. For the last 50 years, people kept trying the same thing for Alzheimer's over and over and over and over again until now, finally, we're seeing some results from things like methylene blue and LSD, which in very, very small doses and very quickly, these people suddenly improve. Even if the proteins in
Wow.
their brain, they don't change, right? So this is something this knowledge was available already 50 years ago. So an open-minded person would have seen this and said, guys, hold on, we're doing things the wrong way. Look at this other information. We need to incorporate it in our theory. But guess what? Because science at that time had already become a career, this person probably existed, went to his boss and said, hey boss, look, I think we're on the wrong path. We need to incorporate this. And his boss said, do you know how much money the government has given us to chase this
But
idea about the beta amyloid protein?
we
Do you
can
want
afford
to
to do that.
Exactly. Do you want to maintain your job or do you
Right.
want to be unemployed? And that person probably shut their mouth and said, okay, I want to be employed. And that's why nothing changed for 50 years.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, that's amazing and so true. And also in science, like I was just thinking, like not only the wrong idea, but also the wrong approach, because sometimes science is based on this reductionist
Yes.
approach,
Yeah.
and you have to think outside the box and see the big picture. And I think Aristotle were one of those guys, so more the holistic
Yeah.
approach to things.
But
Instead of
Aristotle
breaking
didn't have a
down,
career.
trying to find the little thing. It's not always in the little thing. Maybe just eating enough calories or whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
So
But here's the difference that Aristotle didn't have a career. Aristotle didn't have a boss who sit there and
right,
says,
right,
listen, you need to produce 20 spreadsheets today or tomorrow I'll fire you. So Aristotle
right.
had the time to think of these things and accept the world the way it is. Just like Buckminster Fuller said, don't fight it, accept it, learn it, and then evolve, add something new.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Georgi. It's been a pleasure and a lot of fun, and hopefully it helps to promote this idea of looking at things with a different angle, hopefully more cooperative. And thank you so much again.
Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it.
Please go ahead and follow Georgi on Twitter. He's constantly putting like new ideas, new research to expand our mind. He's extremely knowledgeable, as you saw today, and it's been like a real pleasure. So you will find the link below in the description of this video, and also a link to his online store where he sells some of the finest supplements to support, to help with your health. I personally use them, and we need to support each other to help those that are like fighting for a new paradigm, for a new mind in the world, and Georgi is definitely one of them. So without further ado, this is the end of our first dialogue with another person here in the channel. I hope you liked it, and we need your support. So go ahead and share with others that you think they could like them as well. Thank you, and see you in the next.